please, Zelensky. David.
Well, Martha, your notes match mine. I have here no deal until there's a deal, according to President Trump, and that he then went on to say, I will be calling NATO shortly, and I will be calling President Zelensky, of course, of Ukraine. And as I had mentioned, there had been a conversation earlier in the week involving President Trump, European leaders, and President Zelensky, during which President Trump promised President Zelensky that he would call him right after the summit. President Trump telling the world that the call hasn't happened, though he fully intends to do that. I want to bring in our chief foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, because, Ian, you were watching this play out live right along with the rest of us. You've spent a lot of time in Ukraine. What did you read into what you heard? And you and I were talking before they came out on that stage and talked about the fact that Russia now has 20% of Ukraine's territory. And obviously that falls into the category of what we think we heard from President Trump here. Points left, one pretty significant point. I would gather, once we learn the details of this, the significant point likely involves much of that land and who is going to get much of this 20% of this territory that Russia fully intends to hold on to, and that Ukraine has signaled it's not willing to give up.
Yeah, I think there's far more that we don't know than we do know after that press conference. I think many people were sat, glued, watching the TV, waiting to hear what the announcement was, and are rather perplexed now. I think the cynics would say there was much ado about nothing. There was no mention of a ceasefire, and for now the war continues. There's no indication that the guns will stop firing, the drones will stop flying, the ballistic missiles will stop landing on civilian buildings across the country, and the trenches will continue to shoot at each other on the front line. So there's no, at the moment, in the details that we have, there's no indication of an immediate relief for the Ukrainian people. President Zelensky will be waiting for that phone call from Donald Trump to find out what it is that they did discuss. As you say, Vladimir Putin indicated there was an agreement. President Trump didn't go that far. He said there's no deal until there is a deal. So what are the details? And if you can't even get to the first stage of agreeing, which is what Ukraine have been pushing for, with American backing, with the backing of the so-called coalition of the willing, Britain, France and Germany, as well as other allies, that you start with the ceasefire and then you go on to negotiate all those difficult details about what you do with the land that Russia's occupying, what do you do with the 20,000 children that have been taken by Russia, how do you resolve reparations and all those issues. That was supposed to be the way that this happened, but they didn't. As far as we understand, even get to a point where they could agree a temporary ceasefire, a temporary cessation of hostilities, and that is going to be deeply disappointing to many people here. If you're sat at home with your children close in arms, worrying about whether or not the drones will start flying again tonight, you just heard no relief at all.
So again, 7:16 here in the East. We're going to stay on the air until 7:30 to see if we can get any more reporting on this. Ian Pannell, of course, our chief foreign correspondent, who is in the capital of Kyiv, reporting on how Ukrainians are likely going to receive this news, that even though President Zelensky was not at the table and they were not happy about that, they were very hopeful that President Trump would be able to convince Vladimir Putin to at least establish a ceasefire. President Trump made that very clear on Air Force One again today on his way to Anchorage, Alaska, that he wanted the ceasefire and he wanted it today. And he said if there wasn't one, he would not be happy. Here is that quote. I asked for a full readout. I just want to make sure that everyone's up to speed at home on this. This is the quote from President Trump a short time ago. There were many, many points that we agreed on. Most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite got there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate. And of course, I will call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. And so ultimately, up to them. Up to them. And Mary Bruce, our chief White House correspondent, I want to go back to you in the room. Obviously, the major unanswered questions. We heard Vladimir Putin use the word agreement. Any more reporting on what that could entail? And then obviously, President Trump, you know, I also take note, it's very rare that President Trump would hold a sort of a news conference like this and then not take any questions on the backside. You know, there's a critique of all sorts of critiques of presidents in the past, some who wouldn't take questions, some who took too many. That is not something that people have critiqued President Trump for. He often takes questions, and it was quite notable that he left the stage even though there were questions being shouted out and did not take any of them.
Yeah, it is incredibly rare for President Trump to come anywhere near the White House press corps and not take at least a few questions, especially on such a grand stage as this, when he knows that everyone is waiting and trying to figure out what came of this meeting. And we are still trying to get clarity on that. I can tell you our entire team is frantically trying to figure out what progress has been made. You heard Vladimir Putin, as you said, mention that there's been an agreement. The president, you read that quote from him. He went on to say, we didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. Well, we still don't know exactly what that means. What remains to be worked out? What was the progress that was made? And you have to remember that going in to today's meeting, the president was well aware that he was facing a lot of criticism and pushback and concerns that he was already handing Vladimir Putin a win simply by meeting with him, simply by essentially bringing Vladimir Putin out of the isolation that he has faced from Western leaders for the last 3.5 years since he invaded Ukraine. Vladimir Putin today got a lot of what he wanted. He got this huge photo op, that friendly welcome from President Trump, the two of them rather chummy on the red carpet on the tarmac earlier today, then meeting one-on-one for 3 hours. More than that, Vladimir Putin had a chance to discuss other issues we know beyond Ukraine with President Trump and his delegation, things like nuclear arms control, trade, economic cooperation. It appears for now he still doesn't have to have a ceasefire. And that is something that Vladimir Putin certainly does not want right now, even though Ukraine and Western leaders are trying to up the pressure on him to do that. And as Martha and you were discussing earlier, for now he avoids those punishing sanctions. It was just a week ago, last Friday, that was supposed to be deadline day when President Trump was threatening to put new punishing sanctions on Vladimir Putin. Instead of that, he has avoided those sanctions. He has gotten this one-on-one, face-to-face to make his case on Ukraine and a host of other issues to President Trump, and he still does not have to. It appears for now he hasn't agreed to a ceasefire, David.
That's right. So just let's underscore this for a second here, Mary, because again, Mary, you were reporting for the days leading up to this, and in fact, there were the sanctions that were set to go into effect. Suddenly, the sanctions did not happen. President Trump announces this summit will happen instead. Vladimir Putin would be invited to American soil for this summit. The president making the argument that nothing has worked until now, that this is worth a shot to bring him here to America, to give him this invite. The sanctions were taken off the table. Then this week, in your reporting and in others from our team, President Trump did say from the White House that if there was not a ceasefire, if there was not progress, there would be, in his words, severe consequences. So that remains, again, the sanctions, the threat of potentially severe consequences. You have to put that up against the signal that we heard from President Trump about some points left. One of them is pretty significant. The president also looking past sort of the conflict in Ukraine, talking about better relations and in particular business relations with Russia. We didn't hear about sanctions or severe consequences, and we didn't hear, obviously, about any agreement in the short term for a ceasefire.
No, we did not. And look, the president had said, that if they didn't reach a ceasefire, he would put in place those punishing economic sanctions, even though President Trump, by his own admission, has previously conceded that sanctions really don't bother Vladimir Putin. They haven't certainly done much to move the ball in the past, but he was promising that if they couldn't reach a ceasefire here, that there would be consequences. That's one of many questions remaining here. Will there still be those consequences? And of course, he also said that if they didn't reach a ceasefire, he was going to walk away. Well, it certainly didn't look like he was walking away. Based on the brief remarks that we heard here just moments ago, it seems like he is saying, let's still give this a go, even though the president clearly didn't get exactly what he wanted here.
So many questions here, Mary. Just get our control room's attention if you hear anything back from the White House. I know you've put in some calls just to see if we can get some clarity. Mary, thank you for your reporting. Rachel Scott will be traveling. She's in the press pool, traveling with the president back on Air Force One if and when he takes flight to get back to Washington. And she was able to get questions to him on the way here as well. So perhaps that will be a window into what we're dealing with here, what we should be reporting on as far as what's been achieved or what hasn't, quite frankly. I want to bring back in Martha Raddatz because, Martha, not only have you and I traveled to Ukraine, you recently were in Russia. You witnessed in that country what it has been like with Vladimir Putin not getting the attention of Western leaders. He hasn't since the invasion of Ukraine. And you juxtapose that with the images of him arriving in Anchorage, Alaska today, a very warm welcome embrace on the red carpet, and perhaps one of the most telling images that actually just sort of traveled the world almost immediately was Vladimir Putin's smile through the presidential limousine when he got into the what's called the Beast with President Trump to travel to the summit together. It would seem, at least as far as that's concerned, the PR part of this for Vladimir Putin is exactly what he was looking for.
I think it's exactly what he was looking for, David, especially, as you said, in the backseat in the Beast, alone with President Trump, side by side in the U.S. presidential limousine. Now, in Russia, when I was there, he had the military parades there that are an incredible sight to see, lots of goose-stepping soldiers. I also, on that day in May, interviewed Dmitry Peskov, his spokesperson, and I asked him about those sanctions and just what Mary was saying. He said, well, I understand there's pressure to speed up the process, but it's very hard to threaten Russia with sanctions. We are a country that is not loaded and is not overloaded by sanctions. We are the country that's experiencing maximum sanctions, and we're a country that's used to living with sanctions and used to living with sanctions quite well. Now, just walking around Moscow, it's a beautiful city. There's no question about that, but people are suffering. The economy really is suffering there. People are suffering. So he may say that again and again, and it was pointed out to me, well, look, Starbucks left, but we've replaced it with Stars Coffee. We're doing just fine. But you really dig deeper there, and there is truly an economic crisis. But Vladimir Putin doesn't seem to care about that. And if there was no ceasefire today, and if, given what President Trump said, he's now dodged those threatened sanctions, a couple of times, David. Last Friday, when he agreed to this summit and said, the deadline's passed, but we'll have this summit together. And today, if there is not an agreed upon ceasefire, and as Mary said, it does not appear to be the case today, then where are those severe consequences? So there are so many questions left, David, and so much to learn for the rest of the world, and especially there in Ukraine.
So on this point,
David.
Martha, just before I let you go here, we have a few seconds left on this point. No deal until there's a deal, President Trump said. He said many points left we agreed to, but some points left. One point is pretty significant, he said. But Martha, we know President Trump said going into this, he wanted immediately to set up a second meeting, a second summit with President Zelensky and Putin. Didn't hear the word ceasefire, said there are points outstanding, so it would seem any hope of this secondary meeting feels a ways off here.
It sure does. And he is talking to President Zelensky. I'm sure President Zelensky was glued to the television set watching to see what was happening here in Anchorage. But it really does seem a ways off with that meeting. And is it the land swap they're stuck on, David?
Our Chief Global Affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, who is in Anchorage, Alaska, will be anchoring a special edition of This Week on Sunday. I thank you for being here on a Friday night. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live, abcnews.com. From all of us at ABC News, good night.
This